My name is Dora Ho, the Young Adult Librarian at the Los Angeles Public Library and co-chair of the Asian Pacific American Librarian Association Literature Award Committee, along with my two co-chairs, Van Basco and Helen Luke. Welcome to today's Literature Award program. Today, we'll be chatting with several of our 2021 Literature Award winners. Congratulations to all of them, and let this be a celebration of their achievement. So let's start the show. Now, let me pass the mic to Van Basco, the Associate University Librarian of University of Central Florida.
Okay, thank you, Dora. Before we get started, I would like just to read the code of conduct so that everything would run out smoothly. So for this particular ceremony, we, or APALA, seeks to provide an online environment in which diverse participants may learn, network, and enjoy the company of colleagues and guests in an environment of mutual human respect. We recognize a shared responsibility to create and hold that environment for the benefit of all. Some behaviors are therefore specifically prohibited, and those are harassment or intimidation based on religion, race, language, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, disability, appearance, and or other group status. Also prohibited are sexual harassment or intimidation, including unwelcome sexual attention, stalking, threatening speakers, using inappropriate comments, and distracting behavior from participants during this event. So by participating in this event, you are agreeing to refrain from engaging in inappropriate behavior and harassment of any kind through the course of this event. So please note that any participants who engage in an inappropriate behavior or harassment of any kind will be immediately ejected from this event. With that said, I would like to introduce the current president of the Asian Pacific American Librarian Association. Please welcome Candice Mack.
Hi, everyone. I also wanted to just extend a warm welcome to everyone joining us this morning or afternoon, wherever you may be tuning in from, for our second virtual Asian Pacific Award for Literature ceremony. Congratulations to everyone, all of the winners and honorees, and thank you for your beautiful and inspiring speeches. I also wanted to thank the award administration committee members, Dora and Ven, who you met earlier, as well as Helen Look, the jury chairs and jury members. And I also wanted just to remind everyone that this year we're also, the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association is celebrating our 40th anniversary, and we have a 40 for 40th campaign, which we encourage folks, if you can and have the capacity and interest to do so, to donate $40 to our association in celebration of 40 years of leadership and advocacy for all of our Asian American and Pacific Islander communities and library staff. And with that, I would like to hand it over to our fabulous host, Cynthia Mari Orozco, who is the chair of the Asian Pacific American Award for Literature in the adult nonfiction category this year, and also an associate professor at East LA College. So take it away, Cynthia.
Thank you so much, Candice. First up, we have C. Pam Zhang, who is the winner of adult fiction for How Much of These Hills is Gold, a novel. Hi, how are you?
Hi, Cynthia. Hi, everyone. I'm good. I'm so glad to be here with you all.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're just going to get straight into the questions. So the first question we have, and for folks on YouTube, please feel free to put some in the chat. The committee was struck by the use of myths and legends to tell family and community histories. What role do you see these types of stories playing in the remembrance of a shared past?
I think that we all need myths, legends, and narratives to stay alive, to know what to aim for. And that's especially true for immigrants, right? For people in a land that is oftentimes inhospitable for them. And, I've been asked sometimes, like, how realistic the bits of myth and legend in this, or like I've actually often had non-Chinese or non-Asian, commentators or reviewers, like, sort of assume, for example, that aspects of the burial are directly lifted from Chinese tradition, or that, other ritualized aspects of this mythological world are directly lifted from Chinese. It's not the case in this book, but what I was really interested in is, for immigrant families, how, because there is a break from the original culture, they create their own mythologies, right? So growing up, I had family rituals that we performed. I have no idea how authentic they are, but that's not sort of the point, right? I think that's the sort of the power, the sort of incantatory power and promise of coming to a new place, is that you can make your own myths. And I was really interested in doing that.
I love that. That's so beautiful. Okay, we're going to just really deep questions. So next one, is a novel effective as a record of a history?
Ooh, okay. Yeah, we're really like doing this on Friday. Okay, I would say that my novel is as good a record of history as Lonesome Dove, as Little House on the Prairie, which is to say that there is a lot that I owe to historical events. For example, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad appears in a form in my novel. And yet at the same time, again, if what you're trying to create is a mythology, what I'm really interested in almost is the emotional truth of an event as much as the historical fact. And I think that also, in writing this piece of what I call reimagined historical fiction, I became ever more conscious as I did research about how much is left out of recorded history, right? Which is written by the conquerors, which is written by the winners. And, I think a lot about how the role of historians and of novelists are very different. Like, obviously, I'm all for more academic research. I'm all for people going into the field and recovering what they can of Chinese American stories and Asian American stories in the American West. But a lot of those stories have been deliberately repressed and erased. And at some point, we can't recover all of them. And so then it's the job of a fiction writer to use craft, to use empathy, to use sort of the power of imagination, and sort of almost this emotional astral projection into a time that was very different, but through which the currents of, loneliness and desire and racism and misogyny are still the currents that we swim in today. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And for what it's worth, I think that is the correct answer. Your novel is just so stunning and a great representation of how fiction can really kind of bring these stories to light and to really kind of undo some of the past historical traumas that the written record has done. Okay, question 3. The transgender character in the book has a complicated role. How did you research what details would make sense to include?
I didn't at first. I think that I love grappling with this question, because I think the assumption is often that, it was hard to conceive of a transgender or gender fluid character, whatever Sam might identify as in 2021 in this world. But in fact, it wasn't. I think that's something that's really important to remember, and that is sort of weird for me to say as a writer, but I'm going to say it anyways, is that language is limiting. Language is limited, right? It's not that transgender and gender fluid and non-binary people haven't existed. We just often haven't had the language for them, or we've had language that's offensive, or again, we've tried to sort of like shove them completely out of history and tried to give them no language at all, right? Like, I think of all these sort of historical figures who it's like, and then she lived all her life unmarried with her good female friend in the same house. And it's like, hello. Or all those like archaeological digs where they'll find like 2 men buried in the same grave holding hands and be like, I don't know, I guess like comrades or brothers or something. And so all I have to say is like, it wasn't hard. I just, again, started from this emotional place of like, who is this person? What are they trying to achieve in the world? What do they care about on this very intimate level? And then it is the case that sort of further along, it was important to me, for example, to engage a trans sensitivity reader and do some research. But I think it's important to start from that place of character first and emotion first, and then do that kind of due diligence.
Great. I have another hard-hitting question on a Friday afternoon. So how is the discrimination against Asian Americans different from other minorities in the past and in present?
I mean, on the one hand, I think all discrimination sort of comes from the same root, which is, parties in power try to hold on to their power by making any minorities, any marginalized groups sort of fight against each other, sort of like take on this scarcity mindset. One of the books, texts that I read while I was doing research about this time period was Helen Zia's Asian American Dreams. And it was really fascinating to read her record of how, as different sort of Asian diasporas immigrated to the United States, subsequent waves were ones that were already there were weaponized against the new incoming waves, right? So there was a period, for example, when South Asians, Indian immigrants, were actually lumped as Caucasian. And because they were sort of like, oh, you can have this kind of almost white status, then you will take up arms against other like lesser Asians. And then of course, Caucasianness was stripped from them because you're never allowed to have that power. So I think that, while it's always the same in pitting marginalized groups against one another, I think that is one particular facet of Asian American discrimination in the US is this desire for assimilation, this false carrot of assimilation and disappearance into whiteness that is always dangled in front of us, this model minority myth that tells us that if we just sort of like shut up, do our jobs, don't take part in protests, don't take part in social change, we will be allowed to be white. It is just absolutely not true, but it's such a pernicious myth, something that is so toxic, obviously, to a society, but in this very special way, toxic internally, toxic to the individual, right? That was something I was really interested in exploring in this book, and that I think I see more and more as a theme in contemporary Asian American literature.
Great, thank you so much. Kind of at the end of our time here, do you have any last thoughts or words for our audience?
No, I'm so grateful to librarians and libraries. I know we were talking before this about, I think LA's library is opening, and I haven't been to a library since the beginning of the pandemic. And I just can't wait to get back into one and smell the pages.
Oh, I completely understand. Thank you, CPAM. Again, thank you so much. I think we're going to move on to our next speaker today. So we are going to move on to the winner of our adult nonfiction book, which is by Erica Lee, America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States. Hi, Dr. Lee, how are you?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you. Thanks for having us. And congratulations to all of the winners. It's nice to see everyone's Zoom boxes.
Thank you so much for being here. Let's get into it. So our first question for you is, in America for Americans, you strategically take on the task of providing a history of xenophobia in the US that addresses discrimination against various ethnic groups throughout US history. In doing so, what themes about xenophobia did you want your readers to recognize or realize?
That's a great question, and I'm so glad to follow CPAM Jang, who's already started us off on a conversation about some of these systemic issues. And that's one of the main arguments. I think that in popular culture, certainly in the scholarship, we have tended to view anti-immigrant sentiment as something that rises and falls. It's almost seen as something that's natural, a natural consequence of an economic depression, or a natural, unfortunate, consequence of war or a global pandemic. And I felt that it was extremely important to not dismiss this history, to not dismiss it as sentiment, but to understand it more as part of systemic racism. And as part of systemic racism, then anti-immigrant racism it's baked into our policies. It seeps into our culture. It is part of our worldview, this idea of immigrants and foreigners and those perceived to be foreign, right? Which is something that is extremely pertinent to Asian Americans, regardless of our citizenship status, regardless of how many generations we're in this country, we are perceived as forever foreigners. it's really important to understand this as part of systemic racism and part of the institutionalized discrimination in the United States.
Great, thank you so much. So this book really came about at a really necessary time. It was a book that I think our country really needed. Could you talk a little bit about your research process? And also this book is just an incredible, you can tell that an incredible amount of research went into this. This is a behemoth of a book. Could you talk about your research process a bit?
Sure. So I am one of those historians who does try to find those hidden histories, completely in agreement with Sipam Zhang, who says so much of our histories, particularly Asian Americans, have been lost or are inaccessible to us if we don't speak native languages. And part of the research process for any historian, writing a history of marginalized peoples, is to dig deep, to look at sources that may not be traditional, but also for me, this is a history of xenophobia. So there are 2 chapters on Asian Americans, but I root this history in a history of slavery, of settler colonialism, a history of anti-immigrant racism that does include Irish Catholics. It includes Eastern European Jews. It includes Muslims. It includes Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans. So for me, making those connections across time and space and group are really important. This was a book that I was not intending to write necessarily, but it really was formed out of the 2016 presidential elections, when I walked into my undergraduate classroom at the University of Minnesota and was at a loss to explain to my students and answer the many questions that they had about, how did this happen? How did this happen in a nation of immigrants? How did this happen after two terms of our first African-American president? And where do we go from here? And when I thought about all of the books on my shelves by other historians who did treat xenophobia as something that rose and fell and wasn't supposed to happen when we're facing and helping to create racial progress, it was only supposed to happen during times of retrenchment and wasn't supposed to happen during times of prosperity, et cetera. That's when I realized that the existing work, not just the scholarly work, but just the ways in which Americans thought about immigration, that it just wasn't doing us the kind of work that really needed to be done.
Great, thank you so much. Really, kind of related to that, our next question is about your current role as the director of the Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota and the center's current project, Immigrant Stories. Could you discuss that role a bit? And do you have examples of how the project's curriculum has been incorporated into high school and or middle school classes or college classes?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for highlighting that work. I feel like this was not the way that I was trained as an academic historian, but one of the things that I've grown into is to respond to contemporary crises. Respond to contemporary crises around immigration and racism. So it's not enough for me as a historian to simply document the past or to fill the gaps with new knowledge about the past. That past and our understanding of our history needs to be used in order to affect change today. And so this project, Immigrant Stories, is a digital storytelling project. Our website, immigrantstories.umn.edu, has a free digital storytelling website app that's in 7 different languages. So anyone, anywhere around the world can, and they have used it to create their own short stories, record audio, upload images, and edit and create a video that can be downloaded for their own use, for their community use. to be shared with whoever they want to share it with, but also, if they wish, to donate to our growing archive of close to 400 immigrant stories now. And the reason why we created this project was because we were really concerned with the singular narrative around immigration that was being presented in the public sphere, one of immigrants being a threat. And we were also concerned about the fact that when immigrants were subjects of the story, it was through the framing of someone else, either a reporter or a researcher or a writer. And we wanted to really empower people with the ability to choose which stories they can tell, how they tell it, who to share it with, and to use more 21st century digital media tools. So not just the traditional oral history where there's a researcher with a list of pre-made questions that they ask and then they extract knowledge from people, but rather to ask immigrants, refugees, is there a story that you want to tell? It doesn't have to be the narrative of I came here with nothing and now my kid is going to be a lawyer. Maybe it's a story about loss. Maybe it's a story about not wanting to assimilate. So we wanted to empower people with the ability to tell their own stories. And it's been just, I'm so proud of what's been happening. My own students have told stories about being a dreamer, being undocumented, newly arriving from refugee camps. We've gone into English language learning classrooms. We've taken it to Europe, where some of the storytellers are newly arrived Syrian refugees in Germany. It's really taken off. It's much larger than just a Minnesota-based project. And I think that you have the full range of the immigrant and refugee experience that portrays not just the ways in which America is fulfilling its promise as a nation of immigrants, but also equally important is how it has fallen short.
Oh, that's a wonderful project. I'm really looking forward to learning more about that after we're done today. We're kind of up on time. So are there any last thoughts or things that you want to share with our audience today?
I'm just so grateful that there's a venue like APALA that helps to celebrate Asian American literature. I'm looking forward to hearing all of the conversation from other honorees. I want to just, highlight what is, I think, obvious to all of us is that Asian American literature is having a moment, and it's past due. I'm so pleased that there is a group like APALA that helps to amplify and uplift this work. And I want to urge all of us not to squander this moment. We know that it's not consistent across time, but I'm just so proud that there is such a wide range of fiction, nonfiction, children's literature that is available now when so many people are hungry for Asian American stories and scholarship and history. And I'm really optimistic that this work is making a difference right now.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Dr. Lee, so
Thank
much. All right, moving on in our adult nonfiction category, we have, this book's really big, Arthur Dong for Hollywood Chinese, the Chinese and American feature films. Arthur, hello, how are you?
Hey, hi, Cynthia. I'm terrific. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Like, Erica said, celebrating APA literature. I'm here for it. So excited to have you all here. I'm a little biased. I was on the nonfiction committee, and this book, yeah. So I when it came in, I was just blown away. Look at the sheer size of this. It is just, and it's just so stunning visually. A question we have is, a lot of the images that you use in this book actually come from your personal collection. So you've done a lot of personal collecting of film history. Could you tell us a bit about that collecting and the collection itself?
Well, it all kind of started innocently when I was a kid growing up in San Francisco, Chinatown. And, we had about 5 movie theaters all within a 6-block radius, and they all showed Chinese language movies from Hong Kong, mostly, I think all at that time. And they each theater printed up these flyers, for advertising, and, come to next week's program, had lots of pictures and the synopsis and the cast. And my sister and I just always collected them. And I still have them. They're like, I have like 700 of them. They're really big. I mean, it's like, I have a lot of them. But visually, they kind of record a history of Chinese language films as it was being shown and advertised in America. So that's really where it all started. And I just continued doing that, even as I started being interested in Hollywood classic films. I started collecting material on Jean Harlow, actually, because I was a big fan of Jean Harlow. And when it came time to research my documentary, Hollywood Chinese, there was a heavy period of really researching. And I wasn't collecting like a collector, but I was researching material, particularly marketing material from Hollywood that was trying to sell images of the Chinese in their products and on screen, and trying to understand what was going on at that time for each period of time that I was documenting in the history of cinema. And that's how it built up to my collection. And I thought, you can only, and I did full research, not particularly to have images for my documentary, but it was just so visually graphic and so telling of what was going on in Hollywood and the social and cultural attitudes at that time that I thought, this would, I think I should just keep it in my office. I think there's it tells us a story about being in America and how we navigate this particular industry in America as Chinese or Chinese Americans. And so I decided to put a book together.
Oh, that's wonderful. That you're sharing your image, like all these incredible resources with us. The next question kind of feeds into this. So in this book, you use images to illustrate how Hollywood has and continues to perpetuate the myth and misconceptions of Chinese and Chinese Americans. In your use of images, you really highlight the fact that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Your book has been described as a coffee table book. What active and meaningful discussions would you like to see that revolve around your book?
Wow, a lot. Mostly the main discussion that is about representation, about being invisible and how a group of people can become invisible in a particular industry. But I think I don't think I ever use a picture that's worth 1,000 words in the book. I want to make that obvious. I'm glad you said that, because for me, that's what it was. I'm a filmmaker, and for me, filmmaking is about moving images. In the coffee table book, the images are still right there. And what I love about a coffee table book, and it's an interesting word, coffee table book, but a book with images that focuses on the power of the image, is that it gives the reader the chance to stay with an image for as long as he or she wants, and to really look at it and study it, because that is exactly what I did as I collected each piece. And there was a reason why I would collect each piece, because it told a visual story. And I wanted to kind of pass on that experience, or the possibility of that experience, to readers, and for them to conjure up their own ideas, their own topics, when looking at, let's say, a beautifully lit image of, let's say, George Raft in Limehouse Blues, where he's in total yellow face, with the lighting and the positioning and the composition of the photograph is just so stunning. Yeah, okay, you're looking at this, but what are you looking at? Are you looking at the contours of the face, the makeup, or the fact that it's George Raft in yellow face? And what does that say about that particular film and the makers of that film in casting a white man as a Chinese character? And so I don't think I'm avoiding your question with a direct answer, but I just wanted to let the imagination of the readers flow. And if the reader is kind of concentrating on the beauty of the photograph, well, there's that too. And that's why I chose particular photographs, because graphically, I felt they were interesting or stunning or artistic. But then if a reader wanted to focus on the social and cultural questions of that particular subject of that image, well, that's their total. And then there's a combination of the two.
Oh, absolutely. That's a great response. Okay, next question. With your expertise in film, are there any current films or TV shows, 2019, 2022-ish, that feature Asian Americans that don't continue the stereotypes that, of Asian Americans that we've been seeing? And what are your recommendations for people who are watching films and TV?
Oh, well, one film I saw last year that I was really impressed with, both in filmmaking and also in terms of the content and characters, is Steven Soderbergh's Let Them All Talk. And I was particularly struck by the Gemma Chan character. She plays an agent, a book agent. Meryl Streep's book agent. That's a pretty daunting role right there. And I was waiting for some kind of racial content or ethnic content to come up, and it never came up. And Gemma Chan played this character that was a book agent that had ambition and had nothing to do with her ethnicity. And I was very impressed with that. And at the same time, I said, well, why are the filmmakers ignoring that? Because she is who she is, and it's obvious she's not white, everybody else is white. But I think it's impressive that they didn't deal with it, and that's a sign of development for how characters are shown on screen. I really love Kim's Convenience. Is it Kim's Convenience, the series from Canada on Netflix? I know there's been some controversy from the cast in terms of revealing the inner workings of how stories are developed and how the actors in that series aren't asked for input. And I haven't seen the final series, the final season. I think there are 5 seasons. I'm only on season 3, I think. And it's just so funny and so pointed, and the attacks on assumptions based on race are so hilarious. And there's a range of characters. There are immigrant characters, there are Canadian-born Asians, and I just really love the show. And I'm kind of apprehensive of going to season 5 because that's where some of the complaints are aimed at. But the first few seasons, I just really enjoy watching. And I think there's just recently CW released the new series Kung Fu. And I want to mention that series because the guys are really hot. As a gay Asian male, to see the hot boyfriend, and then there's the hot brother who's gay, and it's just it's great to have some little eye candy. I mean, we can talk about objectification and sexualizing characters on screen, but I'll take it. I'll give me those hot Asian males on screen. It's and I'll worry about the social context later.
Yeah, with all the APA literature and films out there, it's almost like we're not all the same. It's incredible. These stories of APAs are just so diverse and show so much nuance. It's wonderful. We're up on time, so I wanted to ask, do you have any last thoughts to share with our audience today?
Yeah, I've got thoughts running in my head, but I think in context of the ceremonies that we just went through for the awards, I'm just really grateful that people are reading our books and that they're buying our books, which is really wonderful because we are all artists. And as a filmmaker, especially documentary filmmaker, we've always struggled to try to make a living from our art. And now that I've written a couple books, the struggle is even harder sometimes. It's like, because there's just the profit margin is so skim, it's so little. I mean, I understand the whole business of, I'm beginning to understand the business of publishing, but, with the awards, just bringing attention to our books and the fact that it covers APA topics, I just really appreciate what you're doing, and congratulate everybody who's on this live cast and in their work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again, Arthur.
Thank you.
We're now going to be moving into children's literature. So we're going to start with our honor title, which is Prairie Lotus by lindasuepark. Linda, good afternoon.
Hello.
Hi. Oh, there you are. I see you, Linda. Nice to see you. Let's get into it. So could you tell us about the research you completed for this story? Did you come across many personal narratives of young Asian Americans during this time period?
No, I did not. I mean, that's part of the whole problem, right? Is the erasure, in writing historical fiction, there's become this kind of fetish around primary sources, right? And of course we need them, and of course it's always wonderful to find them. But I am so glad that some of the scholarship is beginning to question, and it's who wrote it, why did they write it, and why has it survived? And if you ask those questions of any source, that's old, you're almost always going to find some kind of privilege bound up in the answer to those questions. And so if you were from a marginalized community, if there was a language barrier, if there were any number of questions like that, then your accounts were not going to survive and to make it into the archives, as it were. And it's one of the reasons that I write fiction, not nonfiction, and I'm full of admiration for the nonfiction panel we just heard from. And I have learned so much already today. I'm really, really loving listening to all the other responses. But yeah, that was one of the reasons that I wanted to write the story, because there weren't very many accounts out there at all.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it makes sense. Next question. An interracial marriage in the 1800s between a Chinese man and a white woman was at best complicated. Why did you decide it was important for Hannah to be biracial?
Okay, so I have a couple of different answers to that. And the first is that, we are all in our different ways exploring the ideas of sort of borders and power, intersections and power, where two groups or ideas or whatever it is, where they meet and where the power is at any given moment. So sometimes that's literally an international border, when we talk about immigration and those sorts of things. Sometimes it's something like what Arthur was saying: what is the power in Hollywood and how do those decisions get made? And so when you want to explore something like racism, the border there is between the marginalized community and the dominant community, right? In this case, white people. So you could write stories set in, say, a historic Chinatown, okay, which is in itself a sort of a closed and bordered community, right? But if I really want to explore the kinds of questions of what happens when a marginalized person moves around in the dominant culture, then I needed to have the whiteness in my story. And one way to do that was to have a biracial main character. And the response has been very surprising to me in a lot of ways. Not all, but many or most Asians and Asian Americans read this story and they respond very strongly. Yes, that is what it feels like. That is what it feels like to be in those positions. And a very common response from dominant culture readers or white readers is like, I don't get the dad. I don't get why the dad is so unsympathetic to her in so many ways, or that even the people that she can that would be today called allies, they sort of miss the mark, and So the white people saying, why did you do that? And all the Asian people are saying like, duh, So I sort of, obviously that Dr. Bishop's windows, mirrors, sliding glass doors, and I wanted the mirrors for Asian readers. But I think that the dominant culture desperately needs those windows and sliding glass doors, and to show them, no, actually, this is actually what it's like, and I don't know. I mean, just to sort of say, those of you who think you are allies out there, we appreciate that, but you need to be asking yourselves every day, how do I do better? Because some of you aren't. And it's a tough discussion to have, and it's a question I definitely wanted to explore.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. Next question. What do you see Hannah doing next?
Oh, I suppose this is related to a question I often get, which is, the request for a sequel, which is always very flattering for an author, saying that the person, the reader who asks would like more of that story. And I would never say never. But I am kind of a standalone gal. I like to write a story in which the reader can continue the narrative in their imaginations. So I often spin it around and I'll say, well, what do you think happens to Hannah next? Where do you see her? The original manuscript a million years ago was a YA novel rather than a middle grade novel. And so there was a romance, which was Hannah and the character who became Sam in this story. So I suppose that's where it would go next, which would be, once again, an interracial relationship. So, I mean, that's just off the top of my head, that the seeds were laid there in the first book, but no definite plans right now for a sequel.
Okay, it makes a lot of sense. So, just because of time, we're wrapping up. Do you have any last comments or things you want to share with our audience here today?
I really liked hearing the speakers who came before me talking about their efforts. For my part, as a writer of books for young people, I'm really trying to focus my efforts on educators, teachers, and librarians, which is why I'm so grateful for APALA and all that you do. But of course, it is impossible to teach, for example, American history from every single angle of every single group and every kind of marginalized people there were, but that is not the point. The point is to let young students know from preschool, from kindergarten on up, that there is no single story. And the way American history is presented so often is as a single story. Right. So it's just to adjust the entire attitude in a classroom to say, we only have time to learn this much, but here's the lens, here is the tool for you to say, there's so much more. And we've only explored a few different angles or perspectives on this particular time of history. And as you grow up and go through life, ask questions and find out about all those other pieces, especially those that are relevant to you or that are especially passionate, because it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized what a crap job had been done teaching me American history, teaching all of us. Right? We all know so little. We all know only the main narrative that the power dominant culture has wanted us to hear, and that puts them in the best possible light. And it's just so high time that we have a different way of teaching history and the attitude towards history, especially in our young people. And we can see every single day how crucial it is to our lives today. This misshapen, grotesque kind of history we've been given, most of us, all our lives.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Linda, for being here today. We're going to move on now to our next children's literature title, the winner, When You Trap a Tiger, written by Tay Keller. Hi, Tay.
Hi, thanks for having me here.
Yay, thanks for coming. We're really excited. First question. Okay, I practiced this. Tell us about your Haimoni. Did you write this book to honor her legacy? Also, did I get that right? Ish.
Ish, yeah. So in a lot of ways, yes, I wrote this kind of based on my relationship with my hominy and the stories that I grew up hearing from her. So she lived with my family when I was younger, and I used to run into her bedroom at night and beg her to tell me fairy tales. And the story that she always told me was a story about the tiger and two little siblings who outsmart this tiger and escape up into the sky and become the sun and the moon. And I just felt like that story was magical. And that story always connected me to her. And I felt like this is my family history. This is the story of my hominy. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I started talking to her, and she started to tell me stories about her real life. And she started to tell me her real life growing up in Korea and how she eventually came to the US. And I realized at that point that she had been telling me stories my whole life, but I hadn't actually heard about her. And I became really interested in this question of what are the stories that we hear? What are the stories that become our family history? And how do these fairy tales sometimes mask and sometimes illuminate the real history? So a lot of this book was me asking myself that question and kind of trying to unravel the mythology of my family history and honor the stories that came before from the generations before. But also I really loved what C. Pam was saying about mythology and trying to balance the past with bringing in new ideas and inventing new mythologies and thinking about what are values that are important right now and for the future, and how to map past to present to future.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. Our next question is, your bio states that you write about biracial girls struggling to find their voices. Did you struggle with this growing up?
So I am lucky because I grew up in Hawaii, where it is very common to be biracial, and specifically it's common to be Asian and white, which is what I am. And so as I was growing up, I was surrounded by a big community of biracial people, and I didn't really question my own identity. It was accepted and embraced and celebrated. And it wasn't until I left Hawaii, when I went to college on the mainland, that all that really changed for me. And I went from an environment where I was surrounded by people who looked like me and understood, the influence of multiple cultures, to a place where that was very rare and it wasn't understood. And I noticed that people had a tendency to try to put me into one box or another. And because I hadn't grown up trying to navigate this, I didn't know what to do with this reaction. And so I became very passive about it. I kind of felt like I just had to be the way that people saw me, and other people got to define my identity. And I started to put on qualifiers to my identity. I started to say things like, oh, well, I'm only part Asian, and I'm Asian, but not really, only kind of. And I started to separate myself from my identity because I felt like that's what I had to do. And it became very painful because over the course of a few years, I realized that what I was doing was I was participating in my own erasure, and I was negating this part of me that was so essential. And so part of me writing books, and specifically part of me writing When You Trap a Tiger, was becoming active about claiming my identity again and really learning how to do that and learning how to own it for myself and learning that I could define who I was, and I didn't necessarily have to just be what white people saw when they looked at me. And there are so many authors here right now that I grew up reading and that I'm reading now, and reading those books has been so essential for me to understand who I am and understand the history of being Asian American. And so I feel really grateful because that has been so important to me. And that's partly why I feel so passionately about writing now and kind of paying it forward, because I know that I have biracial readers who are struggling with these questions. And I want to be able to write a book that says, you are real and I see you.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. You already started talking about Hawaii, but we do have another question. Your home state is in Hawaii, and you mentioned wanting to write a book set in Hawaii, but do it right. What do you mean by this, and what are you considering writing about?
So I don't want to be too specific because this would be very far in the future. But I do know that I eventually would like to write a book set in Hawaii. And that can be a little bit complicated because, like I said, for me, growing up Asian biracial, I felt so accepted and safe, and I loved Hawaii, and I'm so grateful to it. And that identity in Hawaii felt so easy and welcome. But also, the racial history in Hawaii is very dark, and it was violent. The way that the U.S. took over the state and took over and pushed out Native Hawaiians was very violent. And the U.S. colonizers and the missionaries brought over Asians to be laborers there and kind of be the labor class in between the missionaries and the Native Hawaiians. And so that racial dynamic, the history, is something that I want to be very respectful of and do justice to. And I think, this is an Asian Pacific award, but those are two distinct groups, and especially that's so clear in Hawaii. So that's something that I think about a lot. So I want to be able to write a book that acknowledges that while also celebrating my home state, because it is a place that I loved growing up.
So thank you for that response, and we look forward to reading all your future work. So yeah, we will be watching and waiting. Thank you so much. We have to move on to our next award winner. So we're going to actually go on to the Youth Literature Award winner, Andrew Fukuda, This Light Between Us. Andrew, hello.
Hi, good afternoon. How are you?
Well, how are you?
I'm doing well. It's such a pleasure to be here. Such an honor. I'm learning so much from everyone who's spoken before.
I know it's been incredible so far. We're really looking forward to our conversation here. Let's get into it. Is any particular character in This Light Between Us your favorite? Yeah, so most of the characters in the book are Japanese American or of Japanese origin. The other protagonist, her name is Charlie Levy. She's probably, she's one of the main characters. She's on the cover of the book. And I liked her a lot. She proved to be the most challenging character for me to write, only because she's a Parisian Jewish teenage girl living in the 1940s, of which I am none. And I have very little experience or know-how of what it's like to be a Parisian Jewish teenage girl living in the 1930s and 40s. So, but I felt that it was very, very important for her to come across as very real and authentic. She's such a fundamental part of the book. If the readers aren't buying into it, then the book is done from the very beginning. I also, I had to make her feel authentic, but also likable. She and Alex, who's the other protagonist, they form a pen pal relationship. Him in Seattle and she in Paris. And for many parts of the book, she's gone. Her silence and absence hovers over the pages of the book, and Alex is torn apart by that. And I needed for his pain to be shared by the reader's pain. And so, I really had to make her authentic. I knew nothing about what it was to write someone like that. So it took a lot of reading books, reading other literature, trying to get into the skin of someone like that. And in the end, I'm just happy because she seems so real. I think most authors know that sometimes you create a character and they seem so real to you, almost as more real than other people in your actual life. And what's funny about this is when the audiobook came out, I remember listening to the book and I got chills because the person they picked to play her on the audiobook her voice was exactly the voice I had running in my head for about 2 years. Like every intonation, every accent point was exactly the person I had in my head. So that was a very nice surprise. My publisher did a great job of picking the right person. Oh, that's wonderful. We'd like to know a little bit more about your research. Were there any interesting historical events that you researched, but you didn't end up including in this Light Between Us?
Yeah, you know, there are tons. I did so much research on this, partly because the history is fascinating to me, and there's so much to delve into. And I could have taken this book in about a dozen different directions. There was just a wealth of historical information. But one of the pieces of information, or historical facts, I really wanted to include in my book. And I think I wrote whole chapters and try to divert the story and push it in that direction, but it just never got there. And my editor, she said, you know, it has to go. And it felt like she was tearing out my heart from the book. But in Manzanar internment camp, there was actually what was called Manzanar's Children's Village. And it was a village within the camp for orphans. Children who would come in, or young teenagers, and they had no parents and no place to stay. But because they had Japanese blood in them, they had to be put into the internment camp. So they created this children's village. And what's especially painful to read about that time is that they were in a camp where everyone was outcast and pushed out by society. These were children who were pushed out by those who were pushed out. They were ostracized in Manzanar. The other internees, 10,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans, wanted nothing to do with them. They were tainted. I think it was just a very cultural thing back then. To be without parents was something that was, I guess, tainted you and made you an object beneath you. So there were so many heartbreaking stories about what these children went through and what they must have felt. And I wanted to include that very badly in my book, but it just didn't happen.
So this might be a related question. I think our last one for today. Your Hunt trilogy and this Light Between Us are quite different. Any hints as to what you might tackle next?
It'll be a different genre completely from the Hunt trilogy. And also, I probably won't be doing historical fiction. I think I just, you know, when you do the trilogy, it consumes so much of your years and life. And when you dive into historical fiction, there's so much research and it takes so much time that after a while, you just want to kind of flex your other literary muscles and see if you can do something you haven't done before. So I think I'm leaning towards something completely different. Maybe something, if I had to describe it, maybe it's a mashup between like Dear Evan Hansen and The Fault in Our Stars, something like that. But I'm not entirely, I mean, I know what's in my head and what I'm writing, but I'm not exactly sure how to describe it, but that's the way I would describe it.
All right. Excellent. Thank you so much for coming here today and sharing this conversation with all of us. We're going to move on to our honor title. So thank you, Andy. So next we have Displacement by Kiku Hughes. Hi, Kiku.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for being here. Let's get into it. All right. First question. Do you have a favorite scene in Displacement?
Yes, actually. My favorite scene for various reasons was the funeral scene that I drew of the funeral sort of celebration and mourning, collective mourning for the murder of James Wakasa, who was a man murdered by guards at the Topaz incarceration camp. And it was a very difficult, but also very cathartic scene to write and to illustrate because it sort of encapsulated to me the power of memory, which was a big theme in the book, and of remembering these moments of tragedy and of coming together as a community to do that, and the power not only to heal, but also to as an act of resistance, as an act of protest, just the act of remembering those that we've lost and you know, coming together to do that is a big moment. And I think, you know, especially in a year where a lot of people have had so much loss, and there has, you know, been obviously this rise in anti-Asian hate crimes and a lot of pain, coming together and using that as a way to empower a community. It felt very important.
Thank you for sharing that. So how did you approach doing the research for displacement? Was there anything particularly surprising that you learned?
There was a lot surprising that I learned, and a lot of that was because, as many people have spoken before today, there's the research in a lot of Asian American history is so limited, especially when you don't speak, the language of your ancestors, and because of the ways in which American history tends to leave out so much. There's so much unsaid, so for research, I knew the basic structure of the book was going to be based around the events at camp that I already knew based on family history, based on things that I had grown up knowing. So things including the murder of James Okasa, I'd grown up knowing about that moment and hearing the various retellings of that story and how nobody really knew what happened. So diving into different points in my grandmother's life that I knew these vague points about, and then really expanding from there and seeing, okay, what are the actual documents that record this? And then finding out that so many of the documents are also very unsure of what happened. I would look at newspaper reports from the times. The Topaz, I think all camps had their own newspapers that were created by the incarcerees, but then of course were censored by the WRA. So reading the newspapers at the time it was interesting, but it was not a reliable source of information because so much was censored even at the moment. So that was really interesting, but hearing firsthand accounts with the help of projects like Densho, which is an archival organization that does incredible work, archiving these stories, firsthand accounts and various other accounts of Japanese American incarceration. Hearing stories of resistance was the big, surprise, and also, the most exciting thing to read about for me. Because one of the problems I think with stories about Japanese American incarceration, especially when I was growing up, is this tendency for writers to create this sort of monolithic response that people in camp had. This sort of put your head down and just get through it and be, loyal and be good, and they'll see that we are, loyal Americans. But reading about the various ways in which people resisted, including pushing for a public funeral for James Wakasa, including work stoppages and various other ways that people in camp at the time, and the No-No boys, of course, resisted what was happening to them and spoke out, and even the smallest acts of resistance. That was surprising because, again, growing up, you hear this very monolithic story.
I'm just loving how much all the authors today are talking about really, getting back into the historical record and just making some of these wrongs right and revealing these truths. And it's such a beautiful sentiment. So we want to ask about kind of the artistic side of the design. The color palette for displacement is particularly striking. Do you have anything you'd like to share about your thoughts behind the colors in displacement?
Well, thank you so much. I was really lucky enough that I was able to take a trip to the site of Topaz, which is now, in the process of being completely preserved by the Topaz Museum, which opened several years ago. It was still relatively new. And they're preserving the area that the camp was actually at, which is in central Utah, sort of southwest central Utah. And being there, it really struck me just how the landscape was so gray, really. It's this desert with this sagebrush and the very dusty soil, but it's very gray. And I think it really inspired the sort of color palette that I ended up using for the story, which I didn't want to use a lot of vibrant colors because the landscape was so washed out and was so kind of bleak in a lot of ways. And there was actually an interesting moment where my editor sort of said, can we indicate Utah a little bit more with some maybe red rock features on the cover? And I was like, that's absolutely not where people were. They were not in these beautiful canyons and Utah is so gorgeous in some places, but this is not that part of Utah. So I really wanted to make that, very clear in the illustrations, the sort of barrenness of the landscape. which was a really big part of the experience there. The dust that exists, that was sort of everywhere, ubiquitous in every story of Camp You Hear, is that, oh, it was so dusty, or the dust got everywhere. And I didn't understand really how much that was true until I visited. And really, every step you take is just this plume of dust, of this sort of white gray dust, and it just makes everything so dull, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, those visuals really came through, and it was really interesting to hear about the editorial decisions being made there and standing your ground on that. Thank you, Kiku, so much. We have to move on to our picture books. So thank you again. We're actually going to go to our paper book winner, Paper Sun, The Inspiring Story of Tyrus Wong, Immigrant and Artist, written by Julie Lung and illustrated by Chris Sasaki. So I think we'll start with Julie. Hi, Julie.
Hi, so happy to be here.
Yay, thanks for coming. So what inspired you to write Tyrus Wong's story? Where did you hear about Wong's story and what drew you to it?
Yeah, I first read about Tyrus Wong through his obituary. He died in late 2016 at the age of 106 years old. And what struck me most were two things. Tyrus's tenacity to always find ways to put his art everywhere. He not only contributed as much to American animation, but he drew on murals, menus, cards. Late in his life, he made these incredibly elaborate kites that were just hundreds of feet long and took 8 people to get into the sky. And also, I was struck by the fact that he was a paper son, which is a form of illegal immigration in response to the Chinese Exclusion Act that many Chinese Americans can trace their roots back to. And as I was writing, this was during 2017, 2018, when a number of immigration topics were already in the headlines. And here was Tyrus's story, like a fable, coming to really just show how much, Tyrus represents so much of the typical American dream, right? Like a man of immense talent who comes to a new country to contribute so much. But it was also so important to me to show how he came at a time when he was explicitly not welcome. And I loved reading about him. I wanted to share that story. I didn't grow up with a lot of stories that told me about fellow Chinese Americans. And so I wanted to write that.
Yeah, it's been so incredible to hear that sentiment throughout a lot of these stories here today, and what drew you to the writing. And you kind of touched on this, but could you talk a little bit more about the research you did to write Paper Sun?
Yeah, there's a fantastic documentary, I think it's just called Tyrus by Pamela Tom. That was one of my primary resources. And I also had the incredible pleasure of actually working with the Wong family on the manuscript as well. Tyrus had 3 daughters, and they were able to provide, just wonderful anecdotes and extra material that I could use. And Tyrus himself has also given just numerous interviews, for Angel Island and also for Walt Disney. And so I was able to draw on a ton of great source material. And I just love sort of hearing, it echoes, I think about this all the time as I do a lot of historical nonfiction, the idea of the privilege of having the ability to leave something like that behind. I wrote another picture book about Hazel Ying Lee, who was the first Chinese American woman to fly for the U.S. military. And because she died before she was able to have children, she didn't leave much writing behind. It was a lot harder to sort of find those people to talk about her. And I just think that, as the work is there, the work is on so many creators to reconstruct these histories where there are none. And I'm so grateful and so honored to be amongst so many of incredible writers doing that work now.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. That's really wonderful. What messages or themes do you hope readers will glean from the book?
What echoes in my mind a lot is particularly over the past few years, is just how the distinction of legality is just a line drawn by those in power who will never feel the human cost of that line. At 9 years old, Tyrus was separated from his father for months on Angel Island, not knowing what happened, without any grasp of the language. He also never saw his mother again. They were not able to travel back or bring her over. And so, you see these interviews with Tyrus, and when he talks about, his time on Angel Island, you can see the pain on his face. You can see how, when he says that those were the worst months of his life, you believe it. And, it is a children's book, it's a picture book, and there's only so much pain you want to, convey. But I did want to highlight that human cost but also show Tyrus's resilience and the resilience of most immigrants to just rise above those obstacles. And yeah, those are the messages and themes I hope eventually, stick with kids as they get older.
Oh, it's wonderful. I can't wait to share this book with the young children in my life. Leading up into our talk with Chris next, I wondered if you could talk a bit about the process working with your illustrator.
So the fun story that many people ask us is they think Chris and I worked really close together. I actually never got to meet Chris until we started doing events together. Anne Shorts, our incredible editor, managed most of that. I finished the manuscript, I give it to her, and then she works with Chris to sort of find elements to focus on. And the picture book is beyond my wildest dreams. Like, Chris has done such an incredible job. It is like visual poetry. There are like pieces of it that, he just got, and I, didn't have to say anything. I wrote certain lines. I was like, I hope this gets illustrated. And when I saw them, I was just completely blown away. But yeah, I'll let Chris speak to some of his inspirations, but it's truly like a dream come true.
Oh, it's so interesting. Andrew also said similarly, the audio narrator they got was like what he had imagined in his head. And so it's so interesting to hear that, you just kind of saw the final product and it was amazing. All right. We have to move on to Chris now, but thank you so much, Julie, for being with us today.
Thank you.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Good to see you. All right. So could you talk to us a bit about the process of illustrating this book? Since the subject was an illustrator, did this change your process at all?
Yes. I felt like I think this book was very special, and I knew it, and I felt this pressure, I'd say, because I also went to school for animation. I remember studying about Tyrus Wong, so I was exposed to his work pretty early, and I knew how much of an impact he played in the animation community. And so for me, it just felt like this pressure of like, oh no, I can't draw like Tyrus. I don't think anybody can. I think there's like this expectation. And I already felt like this pressure, like I'm already letting the family down and like people who know Tyrus's work down. And so I think my approach actually, when I remember first getting the manuscript, I was like, oh, I can't do this. This is giving me anxiety already. But actually, I actually reached out to Kim Wong, Tyrus's daughter, and talked a little bit. And it was actually cool because like she gave me a little bit of insight. It was just like, it's not really about Tyrus's work. Everybody knows what Tyrus's work looks like. It's about his story. And it's like, I know Tyrus and he would want something that's cool and modern. And I think you have the right, approach to kind of tackle that. And that gave me a little bit more of the confidence, I'd say. I think I was still a little bit just carrying a little bit of that weight with every page, but yeah, I think just diving into it, that was a little bit of my concerns going in. But yeah, the process, for me was like, I knew I couldn't paint like Tyrus, and so I tried to find my way in. I remember going to I went to the Walt Disney Museum, and I remember what struck me was not so much, his work for Bambi was beautiful, but I remember the kites that really stood out to me. And somehow it reminded me of my grandfather too, of we made kites together, and and it actually made me think of like my family and our history, and coming to the States. And I think for me it was like, oh, this is my way in. I love Tyrus, and it's so much about his work feels very like atmospheric and lots of air in his work, and so the kites just felt really appropriate. And so when I first started, at least my process was I tried to make these decorative design patterns of kites, whether it's like people or objects in the room, to try and make this repeating pattern similar to like his caterpillar kites, and try to echo that throughout the book. And that was my first stab at kind of like tackling that. And then there's some of those pages that are still present, when people are leaving the boat to Angel Island, you'll see like a pattern that's similar to his kites. And even like when he's at Disney, you'll see like a repeating pattern of people, working away at on their light tables and things. But yeah, that was like my way in to kind of like find approach to kind of telling this person's story.
Oh, that's beautiful. I can't wait to reread the book and look for all those visual cues you just told us about. I think you answered that. Are there any projects you can talk about that you're currently working on?
Yeah. Let's see. Well, I'm working on a film project right now, and I can't talk about that. But I just finished a book. It's called Sakamoto Swim Club. And it's based off the Soichi Sakamoto from Maui, a science teacher who taught kids to swim in irrigation ditches, who eventually became Olympic champions. And that was a special book for me. I have family in Hawaii, and I think for me, I just felt like it was like exciting me. I remember too, where I remember getting the offer while I was in Hawaii on my honeymoon. So it just kind of like, I don't know, I felt this like natural reaction, like I gotta do this book. But yeah, I think that's like the book that I guess is out. It just came out recently. So that's one thing I can like talk about. Yeah.
Oh, that's perfect. I am looking forward to reading that book and seeing those illustrations. Thank you so much, Chris. We have to move on to our last author.
Sure.
All right, our last book or last author for the day is the picture book Honor, which is Danby Leads the School Parade, written and illustrated by Anna Kim. Anna, hi.
Hi. Hi, thank you.
Good to see you. All right, so let's get started. How was this book based on your personal experiences?
Well, it was confluence of things. My nieces were born, and I was looking for picture books, and it was really hard to find positive, like Asian American character books for little girls, and after looking for literally a couple years, I just thought, okay, I need to just create a character that little Asian American children can relate to and can identify, somebody who was heroic and had that cultural element. And so I have this memory of the first day of school where I just was standing in front of everybody, just completely numb and just, I remember everything, but I feel nothing. You know, it was just one of those memories. So I went back to that memory and I wrote this story with this character in mind who was heroic, who was strong, who really displayed hero traits as an Asian American child. And so that's how that became. But it really started with my nieces who, yeah, she couldn't find books that she could connect to. So, yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. Many children's books carry important life lessons for readers that we hope they'll take into their adult years. What message do you wish to provide to young and old readers in your works?
I think I thought about this one for a while, especially when I was writing the book. I think that I really feel you change someone, or you kind of like convey the message of acceptance when you have that emotional connection with somebody. I really feel that little connection, that small little connection that you make forever transforms your life. And I really felt that little element of friendship was really yeah, it's really that level of just tiny little gesture of friendship can change a course of someone's life. And that was with me, my first friend in America. And just I see over and over like my parents who are completely Korean, and we have their children have friends from all different walks of life, and they've learned to love them too. And it's just, I think it's a message of friendship. Little tiny gestures matter, and it makes a big difference in every single child's life. And I think that is really my message.
Oh, wonderful. We also have a YouTube comment that says on our live stream, when reading your work, I was reminded of one of my older cousins when she first came over to the United States, and so much resonated with what she experienced. And that's from Arya. So I think that was in line with what you were just talking about.
Okay.
Will we get to see Danby in more adventures? So the question here said it would also be great to see a Danby series.
Well, I'm working on the second book for Danby. I think it would be great to have a character who's Asian American and the melting pot of cultures in her story. That's really what I'm trying to do. Let's see how it goes.
Oh, that's wonderful. Looking forward to that. What do you see in your future writing and illustration pursuits? I think that'll be our last question.
I think that I like stories which are meaningful and has depth, but conveyed in a way that little children who's like tiny, 2-3 years old even can get. And also adults who are sophisticated readers can understand. There's a level of meaning. That is my hope and dream. But yeah, my dream is to really illustrate beautiful books and write stories that are meaningful.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. You're doing
you.
that already. Thank you for sharing with us. I think I'm handing it over to Helen.
Thank you so much for everyone for joining us today to celebrate APA literature. Congratulations to all the authors and illustrators. At this time, I'd like to invite all of today's participants to turn on their cameras. So if the authors and the committee members want to turn on their cameras. Thank you so much for today's wonderful conversation. Please know that you are part of our extended APALA family now. If you'd like, you're welcome to unmute and share any final messages with the audience.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you, everyone. I mean, this ceremony is always amazing, when we have it in real life, when we have it virtually. But I think after these past, 15 hard months in so many ways, it's even more special to celebrate all of this wonderful storytelling and imagery and history. From the past, the present, and the future too. So thank you. Please keep up the good work and sharing your wonderful stories. We're all hungry for it. Our communities are hungry for it. So thank you for your advocacy and your heart. So thank you, and have a safe rest of your weekend, and hope to see you next year or sooner.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, APALA. Thank you, everyone. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.